I'm fully mic'd up, so everyone hear me okay? Yeah, thanks. So, yeah, Andrew's right. Actually, I was a foundation student at what was Swansea Met at the time, up in Town Hill, and went off to art college. Ended up coming into things like environmental design and wanting to design big town squares, and started off then as a community artist. We set up a community arts organisation and found my way into local authority. It's something about, you know, a city that encourages arts and creativity and those contributions that actually lends to a sustainability agenda. So it's not completely irrelevant to think about those things. So I was invited to come and talk about some of the work that we're doing at the moment, particularly around culture and sustainable cities, which is the title of a specific programme of work which I'll talk about. But also, it's an exciting time thinking about the Wellbeing Future Generations Act, particularly because of the relevance that it gives to culture and the considerations that we need to apply to decision making as, I suppose, civic leaders in respect of how that will impact on the next generation and generations to come. And perhaps, you know, you may have your own opinions on design strategy within places like Swansea. It's a bit of a mixed bag. And perhaps the Act can help inform the plans that are coming on board as we speak. So what is the Act? It's all about improving social, economic, environmental and cultural wellbeing of Wales. And it's come into force very recently. So we are all actually learning about it at the moment. I don't think there's any one organisation that is absolutely clear on what it means and how it will be applied, and also how you can measure and recalibrate as you're going through. But it puts in place 7 wellbeing goals. And those of us who work in the public sector are very familiar with terminology like wellbeing, and we see it applied to things like health and wellbeing, or all sorts of scenarios in terms of recognising, you know, what is required for someone to have a healthy and prosperous life. So 7 goals, and 2 of which are particularly relevant to cultural services, but they're all relevant to some greater or lesser degree. But in particular, the 2 that we focus on quite a lot is about being healthier. So that's looking at physical and mental well-being. And it's also about cohesive communities, attractive, viable, safe, well-connected communities. But then we've got vibrant Welsh culture, thriving Welsh language, and the rights, cultural rights of people to their heritage and to understanding you know, how that applies and where they come from and where they live, and how that then leads to more resilient communities. So there's all sorts of dynamics to be garnered from applying the Act. But as I say, most public bodies are still currently learning. And the Act doesn't sit in isolation. It sits alongside Planning Wales Act, Environment Wales Act. So you've got these 3 acts that all coalesce, and they all get distributed across a number of bodies, statutory bodies, governing bodies, and they manifest themselves in things that each body is responsible for producing within the local authority. In particular, down the bottom there is the local development plan, and that plan is about identifying areas which are appropriate for housing, areas appropriate for leisure, investment, retail, and so on and so forth. So these acts all need to work together, and they all need to be considered together for future planning. So just a list of all the public bodies that it applies to, and these have been washed out in phases, but as you can see, it is effectively all the statutory bodies, and the ones that we would expect to see working most in partnership with each other, but also National Museums Wales and the National Library of Wales, the Sports Council. So these are all public sector bodies that all need to be you know, cognizant of the Act and how it applies and how they influence the decision-making process. So then, in terms of City and County Swansea, the local authority, we have, a tree, I suppose, of strategies, policies and documents, and we're sort of working out how all these things knit together and how, right from the top of it, thinking about the Act and all this legislation, how does that manifest itself and then result in me making a credible sort of proposal for funding for a particular project, however big or small. So the less glamorous side of my job is about kind of constantly referencing that, framing our strategies and our proposals so that they can clearly identify with and fit within the corporate and strategic goals of the authority. So our 5 priorities are as listed. We're all responsible in the authority for delivering against them all, some more, I suppose, more tangible than others. In particular, we tend to do a lot around vibrant, viable city and economy and tackling poverty and sustainable communities. So within cultural services, our vision is to be a premier coastal city destination offering world-class tourism, cultural experiences, ensuring that creative and active lifestyles are enjoyed by all. And then you see our sort of objectives to ensure that everything we do is mindful of all these objectives. So we think about the customer, think about the financial impact and criteria, or sort of long-term sustainability. The performance measures, so why are we doing what we're doing? Are we increasing participation? Are we actually making an impact on people's lives? But it's also about our workforce as well, because we're a big employer, not just in the authority, but tourism as well is a significant employer locally. So we're going to think about skilled, committed workforce. So this is starting now to see how everything starts to follow on in terms of our decision making and how we might then begin to think about long-term strategy for culture. So we have put together a strategic plan, and that's about sharing a vision for the role of culture. And one of the things that's particularly important for us is recognising that perhaps the days of a local authority has been seen to be some parent organisation that you went to talk to because you need a grant or you need to pay your council tax or whatever, or you reach an age and you need your bus pass. But they tend to be organisations that you talk to because you have to, say, or a funding organisation or some other transaction. So we're moving away from that type of way of working towards being more of an enabler, partner of choice. And the idea of governance and just who's in charge anyway really needs to be unpacked and thought about more clearly going forward, because relationships are changing all the time. Access to information is changing, the way we share ideas, the way we deliver services is changing. So we need shared vision, because the universities, the health authority, all these bodies represented in the Act all need to be joined up together. So looking to build a development framework for culture, and we need to develop a shared set of strategic priorities. So the themes we're looking at around the creative economy, community wellbeing and the Future Generations Act, education, skills and research, and cultural planning. And what role does culture play in all of those themes, and how can it be expanded? How can we get better knowledge, economy, more jobs, more skills, more engagement with the learning process through applying culture, for example. So moving on, we had a kind of, this is a kind of very local perspective of thinking about Swansea. But at the same time, as we were talking and thinking about these agendas, there's this whole movement going on globally about asserting the role of culture in terms of a sustainable city or a general healthy populace. So Barcelona 2004, Agenda 21 was developed, and it's promoted by United Cities and local government, and it's guidance for local authorities about the importance of culture in policies and how it's applied, and how they need to kind of sense check and cross-reference and take some stock of themselves. So this then starts to lead back to some of the other slides I showed you earlier on about the Act, where we're looking at a kind of legislative approach around environment and social impact and the economy. So this Agenda 21 puts culture around that frame. So it's a completely different way of thinking about culture as a nice to have, or something you might do if you can afford it, or something you might choose to do, but it's not real stuff, is it? It's just the fun stuff, it's colouring in for adults. Well, this Agenda 21 is very much about place and culture and everything within that as part of city planning and community development. So that led to a toolkit being developed and 9 commitments being arrived at. I'll just sort of go through these a moment. So cultural rights, this immediately references to the Wellbeing Future Generations Act, because this is about your right to a cultural life and society's right to culture, whether that's participatory or passive as an audience member, or whether that's in creating and presenting. Heritage, diversity and creativity, about recognising the fabric of a building, your heritage, the diversity of society, and the rights of individuals to be creative and to be able to express that creativity. Education and a cultural education, and that's not just about going to art college or doing art at school. It's about the application of culture and creativity to all the sort of science subjects and academic approach as well. Environment, economy, the same principles follow. Social inclusion, and then public space and planning. And this is very much not just about the buildings and the choices we make, but a recognition of the spaces between the buildings and how they're used and how these public spaces, assets, so natural environment, lend to a more dynamic or a more prosperous city. Information and knowledge, and this is about access to information and knowledge. Excuse me, I'll take a drink of water. And we're, as I'll show you, we're working with other cities, and we're quite privileged, even though we're sort of in an age of perhaps being a bit more policed about information that we have access to and share. But we have some peer cities that have no access to information, for example. But it's also unpacking the right to knowledge and the currency of an idea, and moving to perhaps a society where it's not about producing something and fabricating it and putting a value on it and seeing if someone will sell it as a creative person, but perhaps recognising the currency of your idea and how you can collaborate and how one idea becomes a bigger idea, which leads to a sort of bigger plan. So that's really about how we share information and develop knowledge. And governance, as I said, it's about recognising that we need a democratic approach to how we govern culture, how we enable rights to culture, whose culture is it anyway, who's in charge, who sets the agenda, or recognising that we need a shared and democratic approach between a number of community groups, the civic side, the academic side, the services, police, ambulance services and so on, the health authorities. There needs to be a more broader governance of culture and access to it. So that's this big global agenda that was going on, that even those of us working in sort of culture and arts weren't necessarily aware of. It certainly didn't impact on the tourism strategies that we were working on previously. So we signed up to be part of a European pilot. So we're in a cohort of other European cities to work through how we might apply all those things to Swansea, and how we can work with colleagues in UCLG and Culture Action Europe and colleagues in the other cities to see actually how are we doing. Because it's quite easy to sort of think you're doing better than you are, or that you're doing worse, or that you think you've got it sussed, when actually you're not necessarily being as innovative as others and so on. So it's trying to kind of put more of a global perspective on some of the local impact. So the outcomes, as you might expect from any peer learning process, but it does involve us doing a fair amount of diagnostics and recognising, you know, how well are we performing against those things so that we can start to prioritise. This is a global network. As I said, we're in the European cohort, and they've just put a shout out for more people in Europe to come forward as well. So we have a few commitments, such as going to sort of global conferences once a year, but they come here and we go to other cities and we kind of work through strategy and policy together. And that is the kind of tree from the bottom up for us, where we have the Act, which is a government policy. We have our local authority policy. We have our service vision and what we want to achieve. We've got a desire to do a development framework and plan with our local partners and stakeholders and creative cultural groups. And we have this global programme that we're participating in. And it'd be quite easy to get lost in all of that and turn up for work every day and go from one thing to the next. But you know, what we need to do is to keep benchmarking, as I said, in respect of what we're getting out of it. So we're going to have to constantly reframe and think, are we going down the right track? Are we getting what we need for the city out of all of these things that we're participating in? So I'm happy to circulate some of the web addresses afterwards, but it's worth having a look at this in order to see, if anything, how these agendas are being applied in other cities. So what does this mean for us? Circling right back to the beginning, we've had a vision to be a premier destination. So as I said, it's always about thinking, well, okay, are we on the right track now? What are we doing? So we've got our current STEAM data. So since 2012, we've seen 19% increase on spend locally, 7% increase on visitors to the area. We've got 5,700 jobs supported directly through a tourism supply chain. So as you'll know from STEAM data, this applies directly to tourism. So instead of think, okay, if we're looking at prioritising our cultural agenda and things like heritage and cultural rights and design and public planning and all these things, and we have this key vision to be a premier destination, so we have to kind of keep thinking about our priorities within that term of reference. So visitor survey, the last one that we undertook, it said that main reasons for people visiting were the beaches, not surprising, landscape and scenery, visiting friends and relatives, and events. So we have to respond to that as well as think about other priorities more globally. We asked our trade organisations what they thought. So between the two surveys recently, so Gower has come out at the top in respect of what the hoteliers and the shopkeepers and the cafes and restaurant owners, what they've said their visitors tell them is best or most important about Swansea, right the way down. And all this is really rich material to us because, you know, when we start thinking about our brand and how we're positioned and how we can really integrate culture into all our planning, we need a better understanding of what people like about Swansea, what people think about Swansea, but we've also got to constantly reference it to Swansea as a sustainable city. So we're taking a new approach to marketing. Part of this is about trying to create expectation. Now, we had previously a scenario where we had an air show every 2 years. So we've made that annual. And that's pretty important because you need people to be able to plan and to have an expectation, not an uncertainty, whether there'll be an air show this year or the next year. We've also looking to put together a programme of absolute certainty over which are the key events of the year. So well in advance, we will be promoting and marketing these events and even can plan around them. Within a local authority, we can often lurch from year to year, financial year to financial year. Budgets aren't set and agreed until around, early in the year, and we start off from the 1st of April, maybe only haven't had a month's notice of the budget that we've got for that year. So this is about trying to get certainty and commitment to planning. So obviously working with Visit Wales around their Year of themes, and have a look at our legendary adventures for our Year of Adventure campaigns. But we've also looking at this notion of shared responsibility and shared ownership of who we work with, how we work. We've introduced visitor information points. It's a VIP scheme, so we work with local hoteliers and shops and restaurants to designate them as a visitor information point. And this is part of a plan where local organisations, individuals from librarians right through to hoteliers are ambassadors for the city, and we're all own and are proud of what we're doing and can share that information. And this is really important because this is about a shift away from the council being the one to do and to tell people what's happening, to everyone being able to both inform the decisions around what's happening, but also how that then gets communicated and shared. Big issue for us is recognising, again, within that changing world of how people access information and knowledge, is a focus on digital marketing. So we put a lot of emphasis on this within the team. We've got a very small team with a very big reach. So we're moving away from print, for example, into working much more digitally. And that's a challenge as well for the local authority, because, digital marketing is 24/7. It's not a 9-to-5 application. So, we, within our teams, are quite happy finishing work, coming out of a theatre late at night and responding on Twitter, say. But within a local authority, that doesn't sit as comfortably with some of the other services. So it's also about recognising that we're not a sovereign state, and that as part of the local authority, we're also a key enabler of people's relationship with the authority and how they feel about the authority, and we have to take that on board as well. So going forward, we retain a commitment to events. I want to see more events in Swansea. It's part of bringing people together, it's a social impact, it's also an attractor. Having a set programme of events is particularly important, but it's about pride and inspirational experiences. And these are the kind of pop-up events that you don't necessarily know are going to happen. You don't necessarily know that Wales is going to qualify for the Euros, and within the space of a couple of days sometimes we're mobilised to put on a major event for 20, 30,000 people in the park, and it's being able to be responsive to that as well is really important, working in this kind of industry, but also always being able to reference why you're doing it and why it's important. So we really want to make sure that planning for the long term, we don't design out the ability to do that. We don't design out in our public spaces, our streets and our parks, the ability to say, wow, look at this, we've got the Olympics, or we're doing something else, let's put on a big sporting event, or let's do something with a community group. So, we're also about enabling events as well. The council doesn't actually put on every event that it manages, as in, we'll be commissioned to run events for other people as well, such as the MTV event, or Proms in the Park, a half marathon. So we will go and do all the health and safety stuff, all the things that everyone hates doing, but which are important nonetheless. And we'll be a good host, and we'll put on a good event for them. So it's really important that when we're thinking about future planning, we design in all the faculties, if you like, that mean it's easy to put an event on. So when we look at places like Castle Square for the future, when we design in the opportunity that you can just rock up, plug something in, and put a fantastic event on without bollards everywhere, for example. We also want to make sure that we don't ignore the old when we introduce the new. This is Glyn Vivian, just opened recently, and I picked this picture because it shows how we have this sort of two-headed scenario where we've got the Wellbeing and Future Generation Act, which is all about the next generation. It's also recognising about our cultural rights and our heritage. How do we preserve the built architecture we still have, the services we still have, but also bring in innovation and new design and new opportunities. So for us as cultural services, it's really important that we're right at the beginning of all the discussions, conversations with our colleagues in regeneration, as I say again, about respecting the architectural heritage, the way people use public space too. So that leads me to just talk about something that's very much on the agenda at the moment, which is the St David's development. Now, I don't want to say something wrong about this because, you know, I'm not the lead on this, but I'm part of a project team. And my role within these developments is to help, I suppose, influence and enable a public realm that is inviting, enables social cohesion, that events can take place in, that people want to spend time, want to dwell time, enjoy the cultural experiences within that fabric. So this is one of the first sites that, of a number of sites that the local authority is developing. So the local authority's taken on the role of the developer, and we've got a couple of companies working with us to look at all the key factors that will enable this to be a good and sustainable development. That includes retail, where people can park their car, public transport routes, but also the leisure facilities. So within St David's in particular, the enabler of the development, if you like, is the number of shops, restaurants, arts and cultural facilities that will also be included. So I'm assuming the tower here is giving you some point of reference in terms of location, but it's also, it's effectively the whole area around where Iceland is, by the church, going down then to literally right across the back of Tesco's. So looking at it from the sort of, if you look up, you can see the market there in terms of the roof, but the plans include the development of circa 3,500 capacity arena, and that's part of a twofold agenda for business tourism, but also more live music events. So again, we're the developer, so we are determined to make this happen. It's a significant part of the cultural offer for the city. Its proximity to places like the Grand Theatre mean that we would have a much stronger offer for business tourism, for conferencing and events, but also lots of live music events as well. The scale and the size of it is really determined by market forces and in respect of you know, what Cardiff have and what Bristol have, and just what kind of acts you can sort of sustain. But next to it is the plans for a brand new hotel, which is up. So this is the arena, and this is planned for a new hotel. Because one of the issues that we recognise is that we're developing global relationships and links and marketing strategies, and more recently strong links with China. But we don't necessarily have the hotel stock or capacity or quality that can service you know, all sorts of growth or different markets. So we really need to understand better what our waterfront development can unlock in terms of hotel accommodation as well, and serviced accommodation and non-serviced. And another proposal that we're considering at the moment is something called Box City, which is coming forward for planning quite soon, which will be potentially in and around Dylan Thomas Square, which will have a kind of Airbnb type of accommodation as part of that, as well as a kind of street food outlets on the bottom. And again, that's all part of creating some sort of cluster destination to increase dwell time and to service a diversity of market. But this is where I am at the moment. Everything's a priority. We have a number of strategies that we're working on. We've got public realm projects in SA1 to be delivered. We've got improvement works to Fabian Way. We've got a transport strategy that we need to get right. We've got our health and well-being agenda that we need to get in place and make sure that we're tackling poverty, that we're giving opportunities to all sorts of people from a wider society, that we're increasing our GVA, that we're introducing digital economy. Everything is a priority at the moment, and it can be pretty overwhelming. So that's kind of where we are at the moment. How we apply the Act is going to be very interesting. But I think it's an exciting time to be in Swansea. I think it's an exciting time to be, thinking about a career in somewhere like Swansea. I'm certainly glad to be back here. I do think it is one of those sort of cities that has got all the ingredients right at this moment in time for it to be a really good quality city with assets that a lot of comparative cities of scale and size just don't have. So, it's all sort of here to the future, really. So thank you. And I think I've probably spoken quite enough.